In this project, I'll try to take this pig nose tube amp that I love and transplant it into this 1950s record player console. Has nice cherry wood all around. This all started as I thought about the way amps look. They all look like they're meant to be brought to gigs, but honestly I play mine in the living room 99% of the time. Whereas old console radios, console record players, they were made with a little bit of style. First step was to gut the phonograph player, take out the tube amp, take out the record player, and take apart the wood parts I wouldn't use. Things like the speaker baffle and the shelf that held up the record player. I really have to hand it to the craftsman here. This thing was built like a tank. Everything was screws and glue and notches for each board with reinforced ledges. So it was a wrestling match. Lots of crowbar, lots of sawing, as you can see here. It was certainly well made. Once I had an empty console, it was time to gut the guitar amp itself. This is fairly straightforward. Remove the speaker from the front, remove the reverb tank from inside the amp. This one was installed with a cheetah rug at some point, and I'll keep that. I think it's kind of interesting. Taking the amp itself out, it's pretty well made. I'm really impressed with this amp now that I've seen the insides. First step to modifying the cabinet was to reinforce the sides with some solid pine. What you see here is thinning out some pine boards so they're the same thickness as the supports for the vintage cabinet. Once they're the right thickness, cut them to width. We cut them to length on the chop saw and then glue them into the cabinet. Again, the intent here is to make it more of a solid pine box instead of veneer on top of a few supports. This tube amp is 60 watts, so I wanted this thing to be able to take the vibrations of a pretty large 12-inch speaker. Now, housing the amp itself in the console was the real challenge here. I thought about it for a while, and the best design I could come up with was really an amp inside of an amp. So what I'm building here is a support system so I can hang the guitar amp into its own wooden cabinet and then install that wooden cabinet inside the phonograph cabinet. It's a little bit overkill, but it seemed to have worked. So you'll see here I have those boards that were built from scrap 2x12s and a piece of plywood across the top that's exactly the width of the inside of the phonograph cabinet. I'm drilling 4 holes here to essentially hang the guitar amp from that piece of plywood. You'll see me install that in just a moment. Countersinking the holes there. And now installing the amp. The amp's held in with 4 screws from the top. I could have just as easily installed the guitar amp directly in the phonograph cabinet, but I didn't want screw holes in the top. I wanted to preserve the look of that 1950s cabinet. I also had to cut some notches, as you see here, in the hanger apparatus, just to get out of the way of the speaker baffle. What you see here is the point of no return. This cabinet was just about perfect in dimensions, but about twice as deep as I needed. I thought about how to do this and eventually just put the entire cabinet on the table saw and sliced it in half. Seemed like a potentially bad idea, but worked out pretty well. I then ripped parts of the old cabinet so I could use it as supports, again reinforcing the cabinet where I had ripped it in half. Next step was to work on the speaker baffle. First, taking out the staples that hold on the grill cover I think these people were paid by the staple. There were dozens of staples in this thing. Again, well built. This was definitely a well-run factory. And I went back and forth about trying to reuse the existing speaker baffle, but the holes didn't quite line up, so I decided to build a new one out of plywood. You see the plywood that I cut to size and slide in there. I have a 3-card gap between the speaker baffle and the speaker hanger. And then the speaker baffle itself, used a nail and some wire to mark the size of the hole, jigsaw out that hole for the speaker, and then drill some holes for the speaker to be attached to that piece of plywood. It's held in with 1032 screws and T-nuts on the back. You can see using a spade bit there to recess the T-nuts. And here's the final speaker installation. I wanted to preserve as much of this 1950s cabinet as I could. Things like the badge that went on the front. I marked where the holes should go and inserted it into those holes. I also needed to move 2 of the rear legs since I cut the cabinet in half, and these were held in with T-nuts. I got very lucky that they had 4 extra T-nuts attached to the cabinet. I think they store the legs there during shipment. That's my best bet, my best guess. So you see I'm installing those T-nuts here and screwing the back legs into those holes. That's most of the construction, so it's time for sanding. A coat of black spray paint on all of the components, really just to hide a lot of the new pine and new plywood, really black out the back of the amp. And some of the only damage that was on the entire phonograph was the legs had apparently been sitting in water, so I spent a good amount of time polishing these up with some wire brushes. And then I put a coat of clear coat on them to protect them from future rusting, hopefully. Then it was assembly day. First step, to reattach the grill cloth to the plywood baffle. And to mount that badge on the front of the speaker grill. To screw the speaker into its holes. And to attach the guitar amp to the inner chassis mount. I should probably have a name for that. Next, the speaker baffle is mounted from the back into the cabinet. And I could not quite fit the amp holder into the chassis. I made it a very tight fit. I actually had to round off these corners with a rasp. It was that close. It was within ½ an inch. So a little more planning could have done away with that. Once I rounded off those corners, it was just a wrestling match to squeeze it in there. I usually keep my tolerances fairly tight so I can sand fit everything in. Eventually it all went in, and the amp is held into the holder chassis with 4 large screws, as you see here. Checking the speaker impedance, plugging in the speaker, installing the power tubes, and the final step for installation is to reinstall the reverb tank. Like I said before, the reverb tank was in this cheetah rug instead of a reverb bag. I kind of like it, it gives some character, so I'll keep it in there. You can always go back and replace it later. I then cleaned up all the wooden pieces with some finishing paste. Again, the whole intent here is to make guitar amps look a little bit more like furniture. Make it something that we don't mind having sitting in the living room or sitting in a bedroom, as opposed to a black Tolex cabinet as they all are. Once the legs were screwed in, that was it. I'll give a few sound clips. And that's it. Hope you enjoyed. Thanks for watching.